Cold rations on a freezing night, hands too numb to strike a match, and somewhere beyond the dark, the enemy listened for any sound. In World War II, soldiers couldn't always risk a fire. One flicker of flame could draw gunfire, one thread of smoke could betray their position, yet they still had to eat, and they still had to fight on a full stomach. So they turned to methods the world has almost forgotten: boiling food without a pot, cooking meat in the heat of buried stones, using sealed cans as slow ovens, even harnessing the warmth of their own weapons and vehicles to prepare a meal. No flames, no smoke, no risk. These weren't recipes. They were lifelines, forged in the silence of war and sharpened by necessity. If the fire died tonight, would you still know how to eat tomorrow? Subscribe and reclaim the lost kitchen of the soldier. Number 1. Engine block heat meals. In the long campaigns of World War II, not every soldier fought from a trench. For the men assigned to vehicle units, supply convoys, armored divisions, mobile artillery, the engine was as constant a companion as their rifle. But an engine could do more than move them forward. In the absence of fire, it could cook their next meal. The method was straightforward but brilliant. A running engine generates a steady, even heat along its block and manifolds. Soldiers quickly learned that this warmth could be harnessed to prepare food, silently and without any risk of smoke or flame. It was a cooking trick hidden inside the very machines that carried them. First, the meal had to be prepared for the heat. Rations, whether canned beans, tinned meat, or improvised mixtures, were sealed tightly to prevent spills or contamination. In some units, foil or waxed paper, salvaged from supply packaging, was wrapped around the food to create a tight protective layer. When foil wasn't available, soldiers used multiple layers of clean cloth to insulate the meal. The food bundle was then secured against a hot surface of the engine, often on top of the manifold or tucked between the block and other metal components. In larger vehicles, where vibration could shake the food loose, it was tied down with wire straps or even lengths of salvaged cord. Once in place, the soldier only had to wait. The beauty of this method was its efficiency. A slow, steady drive over several hours could bring food to a steaming, ready-to-eat state. Even idling in place for long periods could warm a meal enough to make it palatable in freezing conditions. Best of all, there was no extra fuel used. The heat was a byproduct of travel or operational necessity. The taste wasn't gourmet. Meat cooked this way could be oily, bread could turn soft at the edges, and tins sometimes left a faint metallic flavor. But for men who had been eating cold rations for days, the difference was everything. A hot meal, even one with imperfections, restored energy and morale. There were some hazards. Overheating could cause tins to burst, so experienced soldiers learned to loosen lids slightly before cooking. Loose wrapping could also result in spills that left a lingering smell in the engine bay, something mechanics didn't appreciate. But with care, these risks were minimal, and the payoff was worth it. What made the engine block meal truly remarkable was how it turned necessity into routine. Soldiers didn't stop to cook, they cooked while moving, making the most of every mile. It was efficiency born from constraint, a skill that made travel time productive in more ways than one. Even today, long-haul truckers and off-road adventurers use the same trick, proof that a wartime improvisation has outlived the war itself. In an age of portable stoves and instant heat packs, the engine block meal stands as a reminder that sometimes the best tools are the ones already in front of you. Would you trust your next hot meal to the machine that gets you there? Subscribe and keep these battlefield solutions alive. Number 2, Steampack ration heater. In the unforgiving winter fields of World War II, soldiers learned a truth civilians rarely faced. Eating was not just about having food, it was about making it edible in deadly cold. A block of frozen meat or rock-hard bread was as useless as an empty ration tin. And when fire was out of the question, they needed a way to make those rations warm, soft, and safe, without smoke, sparks, or light. That's where the Steampack heater came in. It wasn't a piece of issued equipment. It was a field invention, passed quietly from one man to another, adapted to whatever scraps and tools were on hand. The principle was simple. Harness trapped steam to cook or soften food in total concealment. The process began with finding a container. Empty biscuit tins, small ammunition boxes, or dented mess kits worked best. The key was that the lid could be made tight enough to trap heat and moisture. Inside, soldiers placed the food they needed to prepare, sometimes in another smaller container, sometimes wrapped in cloth or leaves to keep it clean. A small amount of water, never more than a shallow layer, was poured into the base of the larger container. Too much water and the food would boil, too little and there'd be no steam. Then came the heat source. Instead of open flame, soldiers relied on preheated stones taken from campfires long extinguished, or metal parts warmed by engine heat. The stones were placed directly in the container, away from the food, but close to the water. The lid was sealed, often with strips of cloth pressed into the rim or even mud smeared along the edges to stop the steam escaping. Within minutes, the water began to vaporize, filling the container with hot steam. The heat was gentle but penetrating, slowly raising the temperature of the rations until they were soft enough to chew or warm enough to lift morale on a freezing night. It was slow cooking by necessity. A loaf of frozen bread might take half an hour to steam through. A can of stew could be ready in 20 minutes. The method worked on almost any food, meat, vegetables, grain porridge, and could even be used to rehydrate dried rations. And because it produced no smoke and almost no scent, it could be used inside dugouts, concealed tents, or even within the cramped shelter of a snow pit. There were limitations. Without careful sealing, the steam escaped too quickly, leaving the food barely warmed. In very cold weather, the steam condensed fast, making it necessary to replace hot stones partway through. But for those who perfected the method, it became a dependable way to turn frozen supplies into something edible without revealing their position. The Steampack heater was also resource efficient. Stones could be reheated and reused. The water could be saved for drinking once cooled. The container doubled as storage or transport. In a war where nothing could be wasted, this adaptability mattered as much as the heat it produced. Modern campers and survivalists still use variations of this trick, from steaming food in sealed pouches over coals to using double pot setups on tiny fuel stoves. But for the soldiers of World War II, it was never about novelty. It was about survival. In silence, under the cover of night, with nothing but a tin, a little water, and a few heated stones, they made meals where fires couldn't burn. Number 3. Solar reflector, tin cooker. On the open battlefields of World War II, not every front was buried under snow or drenched in rain. In certain regions, North African deserts, Mediterranean coasts, or high mountain passes, the sun itself became a resource. Soldiers who understood its value could cook without fire, smoke, or fuel. The secret? A makeshift solar reflector tin cooker. It began with observation. In supply camps, soldiers noticed how mess tins or polished canteen cups left in the sun grew hot enough to warm their contents. Over time, this accidental discovery evolved into a deliberate cooking method. All it required was a reflective surface, a bit of ingenuity, and patience. The heart of the system was a reflective panel. Soldiers scavenged whatever they could: shards of broken mirrors from bombed houses, the inner lining of ration tins polished to a bright finish, or even flattened, shiny biscuit lids. These were shaped or angled to direct sunlight onto a small cooking vessel. Some bent the metal into a shallow curve. Others simply positioned multiple panels around a can to focus light from different angles. The cooking vessel was usually a small tin or cup, often painted black or darkened with soot to absorb more heat. This wasn't for camouflage, but for efficiency. Dark surfaces convert sunlight into heat, faster than shiny ones. The food was placed inside. sometimes with a bit of water to create steam for even cooking. Setting up the solar cooker was a matter of precision. Soldiers aimed it toward the sun, adjusting every so often as the light shifted. In the still air of midday, temperatures inside the vessel could climb high enough to cook rice, boil water, or heat canned meat to steaming. Even in cooler climates, the reflector could take the chill off rations or thaw frozen supplies without any risk of revealing smoke or flame. The method's strengths were clear. It was silent, required no fuel, and could be built from scavenged materials. It left no trace, no ash, no scent, no glowing embers. In desert patrols where wood was non-existent and carrying fuel was impractical, it allowed soldiers to have hot food without wasting precious resources. But it had its limits. It was useless at night or under heavy cloud cover, and slow in the early morning or late afternoon. Wind could scatter the panels, and reflective surfaces were sometimes dangerous if they flashed light visible to enemy scouts. Experienced soldiers learned to set up in areas where glare would be absorbed by terrain, like against stone walls or inside rocky gullies. Despite these constraints, the solar reflector tin cooker became a trusted trick in sunny theaters of war. It was adaptable. Panels could be folded flat and carried in a pack, and setup took only minutes. For some soldiers, it was the only way to get a warm meal in weeks without consuming valuable fuel or risking exposure. Today, the same principle lives on in compact camping solar cookers, emergency preparedness gear, and even off-grid homesteads. The technology has improved, but the essence is unchanged, using the sun's free energy to make food safe and satisfying. For the soldiers of World War II, this was more than clever engineering. It was proof that survival wasn't always about force. Sometimes it was about finding power in the quietest places. Number 4. Hot stone bivouac cooker. In the freezing nights of World War II, warmth and food often came from the same source: heated stones buried beneath the ground. For soldiers without the safety of a fire, this method became one of the most reliable ways to cook, in total secrecy. It was called the hot stone bivouac cooker, and it turned the earth itself into a silent kitchen. The principle was ancient, but wartime gave it new purpose. Fires drew attention, and in contested areas, the smallest flicker of light could give away a position. Soldiers needed a way to use heat without revealing its source. Stones, once heated, could hold and slowly release warmth for hours, long enough to cook food even after the flames were gone. The process began by gathering the right stones. Flat river rocks or dense dry stones worked best, ones that wouldn't crack or explode when heated. Soldiers avoided stones taken from water in cold weather, as trapped moisture could cause dangerous fractures under heat. Once collected, the stones were arranged in or near a small, controlled fire, often built in a dug pit to hide the glow. When the stones were hot enough to radiate heat visibly in the dark, the fire was extinguished or buried to erase any trace. The stones were then moved into a shallow pit lined with earth or clay. Food, sometimes wrapped in leaves, sometimes sealed in mess tins, was placed directly on or above the stones. In some setups, the stones formed the base layer, with a second layer placed over the food to trap the heat from both sides. The pit was then covered. Soldiers used soil, spare blankets, or even pieces of scrap metal to create an insulated chamber. This trapped the heat inside, turning the pit into a slow oven that could cook for hours. Meat simmered until tender, bread baked through, and grains absorbed steam to become edible. One of the strengths of this method was its stealth. Once the initial fire was hidden, there was no smoke, no light, and no noise. Just slow, invisible cooking beneath the ground. It also conserved fuel, since the stones stored and released heat without needing constant replenishment. But the method required patience. Cooking could take several hours, depending on the size of the stones and the type of food. Timing mattered. Soldiers had to plan their meals ahead, sometimes starting the heating process before dusk so that food would be ready by nightfall. There were also practical considerations. Moving superheated stones was dangerous, especially without proper tools, so improvised tongs or layers of cloth were essential. And in freezing temperatures, insulation became even more critical to prevent heat loss. Despite these challenges, the hot stone bivouac cooker became a trusted technique in many fronts, from forested hills to barren plains. It allowed soldiers to prepare nourishing meals without the risks of an open flame, while also providing a source of gentle heat for warming hands or thawing frozen gear. Today, the same principle is still used in off-grid living and survival training. Campers use heated stones to cook bread in buried ovens. Survivalists prepare entire meals in earth pits, and remote communities rely on stone heat storage when fuel is scarce. The method's endurance is a testament to its reliability. For the soldiers of World War II, it wasn't about culinary skill or comfort. It was about making hard rations edible, preserving strength, and staying unseen. The hot stone bivouac cooker didn't just prepare food, it kept men alive in silence. Number 5. Buried ember clay oven. In the scattered camps of World War II, where every plume of smoke could draw enemy eyes, soldiers found a way to hide an entire kitchen beneath their feet. It was called the buried ember clay oven, part earth shelter, and it allowed them to bake, roast, and steam food with almost no visible trace. The idea was both simple and ingenious. Instead of building a fire above ground, soldiers dug a pit, shaping it into a rounded chamber about the size of a large helmet. The walls were lined with clay, mud, or in some cases, wet soil, mixed with straw to hold form. This clay not only insulated the oven, but sealed the gaps where heat and smoke could escape. The fire was built inside the chamber, using small, dry fuel that burned hot but quick. Twigs, bark, and split branches worked best. Because the chamber was enclosed and the opening narrow, the light of the flames was almost invisible from more than a few meters away. The soldiers would let the fire burn down until only glowing embers remained. These embers were the heart of the system. Unlike open flames, they produced minimal smoke and gave off a steady, even heat that could last for hours. At this point, the food was prepared, sealed in mess tins wrapped in layers of leaves, or placed inside clay or metal containers. Meat, potatoes, bread dough, or root vegetables all responded well to this method. The food was placed directly above or alongside the embers inside the clay chamber. In some variations, soldiers pushed the embers to one side and placed the food on the other, using radiant heat to cook slowly. In others, they buried the food within the embers themselves for roasting. Once the food was positioned, the oven's mouth was sealed. Sometimes, this meant sliding a flat stone over the opening. Other times, it was packed shut with a clay plug. This not only trapped heat, but kept scent to a minimum, essential when cooking within range of patrols. The earth around the oven acted as insulation, holding the heat inside and turning the pit into a slow cooking chamber. Cooking times varied. Bread or small rations might be ready in under an hour. Large cuts of meat could take several. The patience this required was offset by the method's advantages: no visible fire, almost no smoke, and the ability to leave the oven unattended while it worked. There were risks, of course. If the clay walls were too thin, they could crack and collapse, ruining the food. If the embers weren't hot enough, the meal could be undercooked. And in wet weather, moisture in the soil could sap heat faster than expected. Skilled soldiers learned to preheat the oven for longer, check the clay for cracks, and position it in sheltered spots to avoid these issues. This method also doubled as a defensive measure. Once the food was removed, the oven could be broken down and filled in within minutes, erasing all signs of its existence. The next patrol might walk over the spot without ever knowing a meal had been cooked there. Even today, the buried ember clay oven survives in remote farming villages, desert nomad camps, and bushcraft circles. The materials are the same: earth, clay, and fire, and the principle remains unchanged. Contain the heat, control the air, and cook in silence. For the soldiers of World War II, this wasn't a luxury. It was a necessity born from the need to stay alive in hostile ground. Hidden beneath the soil, the buried ember clay oven turned a dangerous act, cooking, into a safe one, giving them the strength to face another day without revealing their position. If you had to make a meal without leaving a single tray, could you? Subscribe and keep this wartime knowledge from being buried forever. Number 6. Body heat ration, softening. In the brutal winters of World War II, some soldiers learned that survival depended on more than weapons or shelter. It depended on the ability to turn frozen, inedible rations into something they could actually chew. And when there was no fire, no stove, and no safe source of heat, the only option left was the warmth of their own bodies. It wasn't pleasant, and it wasn't fast, but body heat ration softening kept men going when all else failed. Frozen bread could be as hard as stone, tinned meat could lock into a solid block, and chocolate could shatter like glass. Eating them as they were wasn't just uncomfortable, it could damage teeth or make digestion difficult in already weakened bodies. The solution was to thaw them using the only reliable portable heat source they had, themselves. The method varied depending on the food and the conditions. The simplest way was to slip the ration under the outer layers of clothing, tucked inside a coat, against the chest, or under the arm. This was slow, taking anywhere from 20 minutes to over an hour, but it worked without tools, fuel, or risk of revealing position. Pockets close to the thigh, where movement and warmth could speed up softening. In extreme cold, the best results came from placing rations inside sleeping bags or wrapping them in spare cloth and holding them between the legs or under the armpits while resting. It wasn't without discomfort. Cold rations against bare skin could feel almost painful at first, and in wet conditions, condensation could make packaging damp. This is why experienced soldiers wrapped rations in cloth or paper to absorb moisture before placing them under clothing. Body heat softening had clear advantages. It was completely silent, left no trace, and could be done on the move. Soldiers could thaw food during long marches, turning an hour of travel into meal preparation time. It also worked for more than just rations. Frozen canteens, small water flasks, and even first aid supplies could be thawed the same way. The downside was obvious. It was slow and limited to small portions. In extreme cold, it could take most of a day to fully soften a large loaf of bread or block of cheese. But in conditions where striking a match could bring danger, slow was far better than impossible. This was a survival tactic born from necessity and grit. It demanded patience, discipline, and the acceptance that sometimes the body itself was the last tool a soldier could rely on. Even now, mountaineers, Arctic explorers, and survival instructors teach the same principle because when every other option is gone, your own heat might be the only thing standing between you and hunger. If the cold took away your fire, would you still find a way to eat? Subscribe and make sure you know the answer before you ever have to. They cooked without stoves, they baked without ovens, they survived without fire, and resourcefulness. Every method was a victory over the elements and the odds. Convenient life hacks. They were answers to hunger in places where hunger could not wait. The tools were crude, the conditions harsh, but the results kept men alive long enough to see another sunrise. And here's the truth most people ignore. The systems we rely on today are fragile. If they fail, the skills we've forgotten will matter more than the gadgets we've bought. In that moment, what you know will matter more than what you own. You've just learned 6 of the rarest soldier cooking methods that worked anywhere, with nothing, in the worst conditions imaginable. If you value resilience, if you understand the power of knowing before needing, this is only the beginning. Subscribe now and keep this knowledge alive, because history has already shown what happens when the fire goes out, and those who are prepared will always stand a better chance.